My father-in-law mocked me, saying, "Leaving you was the best decision my daughter ever made." 5 minutes later, she went silent. He raised his glass like he'd already won. 40 guests laughed along with him. None of us knew that the woman beside me, the one staring silently at her plate, was holding evidence that would destroy him before dessert was even served. Viewer, before you continue, please subscribe, like and share for more interesting stories. My name is Bobby Park, and I'm 34 years old, a structural engineer living in Denver, Colorado. My job is to inspect bridges, parking structures, and high-rises for the cracks nobody else notices, the hairline fractures that look harmless until the day they aren't. I've spent 12 years learning how to read stress before it becomes collapse. I never imagined I'd need that same instinct in my own living room, watching my marriage for warning signs I was too in love to admit were there. I married Olivia 6 years ago, in a small chapel outside Boulder, with string lights and her grandmother's pearl earrings catching the candlelight. Her father, Richard Calloway, stood in the back the entire ceremony with his arms crossed. He owned 3 car dealerships scattered across Colorado, the kind of man who measured other men by their watches and their handshakes. I had neither the watch nor, apparently, the handshake he wanted for his daughter. From the very first dinner I had with his family, I felt it, that subtle, simmering disapproval dressed up as politeness. He called me the inspector instead of my name for almost a year, like I was a hired contractor instead of his son-in-law. What I didn't know back then, what none of us could have known, was that Richard's contempt for me wasn't really about me at all. It was about fear. A fear buried so deep in his own history that he'd spend 2 decades constructing a version of himself that could never be humiliated again. I was just the nearest target. This story is about one night, at his 60th birthday party, when that fear finally cracked open in front of 40 guests, a string quartet, and his own daughter holding a glass of champagne she would never finish. He thought he was destroying me with 11 words. Instead, he detonated something he'd buried for 20 years, and it took less than 5 minutes for the woman he raised to bring the whole structure down around him. I want to walk you through exactly how it happened, scene by scene, the way I'd walk a client through a building that was about to fail. The country club ballroom glowed gold that night, chandeliers throwing soft light across 40 round tables draped in white linen. Richard stood at the head table in a charcoal suit, champagne in hand, looking like a man who owned the room because, in every practical sense, he did. Olivia sat beside me, her thumb tracing small circles on my knuckles under the table, a habit she'd had since our second date. I remember thinking it was affection. I didn't yet understand it was the way she held herself together when she was terrified. Richard tapped his glass with a fork, and the room quieted in that practiced way rich men's rooms always do. "To my daughter," he began, voice booming with the confidence of someone who'd given 100 toasts and never once doubted himself in front of an audience. I lifted my own glass instinctively, smiling the way you do at weddings and anniversaries, the muscle memory of politeness. Then his eyes found mine, and something in his expression shifted, sharpened, almost gleeful. "Who finally has her head on straight," he continued, and the pause that followed felt longer than it should have. I felt Olivia's hand go still on my knee. "Leaving you," he said, looking directly at me now, "was the best decision my daughter ever made." For a moment I genuinely thought I'd misheard him. 40 people went silent in that particular way a room does right before it decides whether to laugh or recoil. Someone's fork clinked against a plate. A woman 2 tables over let out a nervous, uncertain laugh, unsure if it was a joke. I turned to Olivia, waiting for her to do what any wife would do, roll her eyes, correct him, defend me, defend us. Instead, she stared down at her untouched dinner roll like it had suddenly become the only object in the room worth looking at. Her face had gone pale, her jaw tight in a way I'd never seen, not once in 6 years of marriage. She wasn't embarrassed for me. She was bracing for something. And for the first time that night, I felt the floor tilt beneath me, not from his words, but from her silence. 3 months before that party, Olivia had packed an overnight bag and moved into her sister Grace's apartment in Aurora for 2 weeks. I told my co-workers it was because Grace was recovering from minor surgery. I told my own mother the same thing. I told myself that lie so many times I started to believe it, even as some quiet, engineer's part of my brain kept flagging inconsistencies I refused to inspect. I remembered the rain that night she left, how it streaked down our bedroom window in long gray lines while she folded shirts into a duffel bag without looking at me. "I just need space to think," she'd said, and I hadn't pushed. We'd been arguing about money, about his constant jabs at family dinners, about whether we'd ever truly be free of her father's shadow over our marriage. What I didn't know was that on the third night at Grace's apartment, Olivia sat at her sister's kitchen table at 2 in the morning with a laptop open and a banker's box of old paperwork she'd quietly taken from her father's home office during a visit weeks earlier. Grace had found her crying, not from sadness, Grace would tell me much later, but from disbelief. Olivia had stumbled across a discrepancy in a spreadsheet she wasn't even supposed to have access to, an old backup her father had forgotten still synced to a shared family drive from years before. She didn't tell me. She didn't tell anyone except Grace, who swore an oath of silence I wouldn't learn about until much later. I remember calling her every night during those 2 weeks, and how her voice sounded distracted, distant, like she was solving a puzzle in another room while pretending to listen to me talk about work. I chalked it up to stress, to needing distance from me specifically. The truth was so much larger and uglier than my own insecurity could have imagined, and it had absolutely nothing to do with whether she still loved me. It had everything to do with her father, and a number with 6 zeros that wasn't supposed to exist anywhere near his company's books. Back at the party, Olivia's phone buzzed against the white tablecloth, the screen lighting up just enough for me to catch a name I didn't recognize, Camille R., before she flipped it face down so quickly her water glass rocked and nearly spilled. Her hand trembled slightly as she steadied it. Richard noticed too. Of course he did, the man never missed an opportunity to notice weakness in a room. "Going somewhere, sweetheart?" he asked, that same gleam from his toast still lingering in his eyes, like he was enjoying a private joke only he understood. Olivia stood abruptly, smoothing her dress, her voice tight. "I need some air." I watched her walk away from the table, weaving between guests who offered her sympathetic smiles, assuming she was simply overwhelmed by her father's tasteless joke. I sat there for a moment, humiliation still burning in my chest, debating whether following her would look desperate. Then I caught Richard watching her retreat with an expression I can only describe as anticipation, like a man waiting for a verdict he was certain would favor him. That look bothered me more than his toast had. I excused myself and walked out through the side doors into the country club's parking lot, the cool September air hitting my face like a slap after the ballroom's heat. I didn't see Olivia at first. Then I spotted her near the valet stand, illuminated by a single overhead light, standing beside a dark sedan I didn't recognize, definitely not a guest's car, no valet ticket on the dash, parked at an odd angle like whoever drove it hadn't planned on staying long. A woman I'd never seen before stood beside her, holding a manila folder against her chest like it contained something fragile. Olivia's posture was rigid, her arms crossed tightly, and even from 20 feet away I could see her shoulders shaking slightly. I slowed my approach, some instinct telling me to be quiet, to listen before announcing myself. Whatever was happening in that parking lot felt far heavier than a humiliating toast. It felt like the beginning of something neither of us could take back. What I didn't understand that night, what I wouldn't fully understand for weeks, was the history that had shaped Richard Calloway long before I ever sat across from him at a Thanksgiving table. In his early 30s, Richard's wife, Olivia's mother, Diane, had left him for nearly 4 months. She'd fallen into an affair with a business partner of Richard's, a man named Theodore who'd helped him open his second dealership. The affair became local gossip in the small Colorado Springs community where they lived at the time, whispered about at church, joked about at the country club bar, written into the permanent record of who Richard Calloway was in that town. Diane came back eventually, apologetic and ashamed, and Richard took her back, but something in him never recovered from the public humiliation of it. Olivia told me once, years into our marriage, that her father became a different man after that, harder, more controlling, obsessed with appearances and reputation in a way that bordered on compulsive. He built his business empire not just for wealth, but as armor, a fortress of success so visible and so impressive that no one would ever again see him as the man whose wife had left him for his own business partner. When Diane died of cancer 8 years ago, Richard's obsession with his public image only intensified. He needed, more than anything, a redemption narrative, a story where he was always in control, always the one making the right decisions, never the victim of someone else's betrayal again. Olivia's quiet separation from me, however brief and however misunderstood, had become exactly that story for him. A daughter, finally, escaping a marriage he'd never approved of wasn't really about me at all. It was Richard rewriting his own history, casting himself as the wise patriarch who'd seen the truth all along. He needed that narrative to be true so badly that he turned his daughter's private words meant to protect him, into a public weapon against the one person who'd never betrayed her. In the parking lot, moonlight cut cold and blue across the rows of luxury cars, and I crept close enough to hear fragments of the conversation without fully revealing myself behind a concrete pillar near the valet stand. The woman in the dark coat spoke in low, measured tones, the kind of voice trained for delivering bad news carefully. The bank records confirm the embezzlement pattern going back at least 6 years, she said, sliding a folder toward Olivia. Possibly longer, depending on what's in the offshore accounts. Embezzlement. The word landed in my chest like a dropped beam. My mind raced through possibilities: Olivia's company, mine, some scandal I knew nothing about. I stepped forward without thinking, my shoes scraping against gravel loud enough that both women turned sharply toward the sound. Olivia's face, when she saw me, wasn't filled with the guilt I might have expected from a woman caught in some private betrayal. It was relief, raw, exhausted relief, like she'd been carrying something enormous alone for months and had just been given permission to finally set it down. "Bobby," she said, voice cracking slightly. "This is Camille Reyes. She's a private investigator." She paused, glancing at the folder in her hands like it weighed more than its physical paper possibly could. "I hired her 3 months ago." "To investigate who?" I asked, though some part of me, the engineer's part trained to recognize patterns, had already begun assembling the pieces. "My father," she said quietly. Camille excused herself diplomatically, leaving us alone under that single parking lot light. Olivia opened the folder just enough for me to see spreadsheets, bank statements, names of employees I didn't recognize attached to numbers that made my stomach turn. "He's been stealing from his own employees' pension fund," she said. "For years. I found it by accident, and I couldn't just look away, Bobby. I couldn't tell you yet because I needed proof first, not suspicion." The party noise drifted faintly from inside, and I realized the man humiliating me on a microphone 20 minutes earlier had been hiding something infinitely worse than his disdain for his daughter's husband. Olivia walked me through it slowly, right there in the parking lot, her voice steadying as she spoke, like saying the words aloud finally made them feel real instead of impossible. Those 2 weeks at her sister's apartment hadn't been about escaping our marriage at all. They'd been about a single spreadsheet she'd stumbled across while helping her father organize old files during a visit, a backup file still synced from years earlier to a family shared drive he'd forgotten existed. Buried inside it were inconsistencies in employee pension contributions at Callaway Motors, numbers that didn't reconcile no matter how she recalculated them. She'd spent those 2 weeks at Grace's apartment not avoiding me, but quietly pulling threads, cross-referencing old tax documents, eventually hiring Camille Reyes, a former forensic accountant turned investigator, to confirm what she feared. The pension fund, money belonging to mechanics, salespeople, and administrative staff who'd worked for her father for decades, had been systematically drained over 8 years to cover gambling debts Richard had hidden from everyone, including Diane before she died. Roughly $1.2 million was missing. Olivia had confronted him privately the week before this party, not as a daughter delivering an ultimatum, but offering him something close to mercy. "I told him I'd give him time to fix it quietly," she said, her eyes glistening under the parking lot light. "I told him, I'm leaving this alone for now, as long as you make it right." That was it, Bobby. That's the sentence he twisted tonight. I felt something cold settle into my chest as the pieces locked into place. Richard hadn't been talking about our marriage at his own birthday toast. He'd taken his daughter's private offer of mercy and warped it into a public weapon, humiliating me as a smokescreen, a performance of patriarchal triumph designed to bury the truth under laughter and champagne. He used me, I said quietly, to protect himself. Olivia nodded, closing the folder. And now we're going to make sure he can't. We walked back into the ballroom together, her hand wrapped tightly around mine, the folder tucked under her other arm like evidence in a trial neither of us had asked to be part of. Heads turned as the heavy doors swung open, conversations faltering mid-sentence as guests registered something had shifted in the atmosphere of the room. Olivia walked straight past our table toward the small stage where the microphone still stood, untouched since Richard's toast 20 minutes earlier. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look at me for permission or reassurance. She simply stepped up, tapped the microphone once, and waited for the murmurs to settle into uneasy silence. My father said something a few minutes ago that I think deserves clarification, she began, her voice steady despite the visible tremor in her hands. Richard's smile, still lingering from his earlier performance, faltered slightly as he watched his daughter take the stage uninvited. He wasn't talking about my marriage, Olivia continued, scanning the room slowly. He was talking about a private conversation we had last week, where I told him I'd stay quiet, for now, about a problem at Callaway Motors. About $1.2 million missing from the company's employee pension fund. The room's temperature seemed to drop instantly. Forks paused mid-air. Someone near the back audibly gasped. Richard's face drained of color so quickly it was almost theatrical, his hand tightening around his champagne glass until his knuckles went white. "You're confused," he said loudly, forcing a laugh that convinced no one. "She's exaggerating." Olivia opened the folder and held up a single page, a bank statement with his signature clearly visible beside a series of withdrawals. "These are real, Dad. Camille Reyes can confirm every page if anyone here wants to see them." I watched 4 decades of carefully constructed reputation begin to crumble in real time, guests exchanging stunned glances, a few already reaching discreetly for their phones beneath the tablecloths. Richard's glass slipped from his fingers in slow motion, shattering against the marble floor in a spray of champagne and crystal shards that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent ballroom. Nobody moved to clean it up. Nobody dared. "You're lying," he hissed, though his voice lacked the booming confidence from earlier. It cracked at the edges, betraying the panic underneath. Olivia didn't flinch. She set the folder down on the nearest table, sliding it toward a cluster of stunned guests who happened to include 2 of his longtime dealership managers and the family's longtime accountant, a man named Harold who'd worked for Richard for nearly 15 years and now looked like he might be sick. "5 minutes ago," Olivia said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room, "you stood right here and humiliated my husband to protect your own reputation. You took something I said privately to give you a chance to fix this quietly, and you twisted it into a joke at his expense. Everyone in this room either works for you, banks with you, or trusts you with their retirement savings." Richard opened his mouth, but no words came. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, Richard Callaway stood in a room full of people who weren't admiring him, weren't laughing at his jokes, weren't deferring to his presence. The silence wasn't reverence anymore. It was the sound of an empire quietly ending. Harold, the accountant, was already pulling out his phone, his hands shaking as he scrolled to what I assumed was the company's compliance hotline number. Near the back of the room, a woman in a blue dress held her phone low, angled discreetly, recording everything. Richard's gaze swept across the room, searching for some ally, some sympathetic face, finding none. Even his closest friends looked away, unwilling to be associated with what was unfolding. I felt no satisfaction watching him in that moment, only the strange, hollow gravity of witnessing someone's entire constructed identity collapse in real time, 8 years of secrets finally catching up to him in under 5 devastating minutes. Richard was formally charged 6 weeks later, after an internal investigation at Callaway Motors uncovered exactly what Olivia and Camille had found, and worse. 2 former employees came forward once news broke, revealing that Richard had attempted something similar at a dealership he'd briefly owned in Phoenix in the early 2000s, under a different company name, before quietly settling and walking away before charges could be filed. The pension fund restitution case is still moving through the courts. Harold, the accountant, testified extensively, his guilt over years of unknowing complicity weighing visibly on him throughout the proceedings. Grace, Olivia's sister, finally told me the full story of those 2 weeks at her apartment, including how frightened Olivia had been, not of losing her father, but of losing the version of him she'd always wanted to believe existed. Olivia and I are stronger now, though healing hasn't been linear. Some nights she still apologizes for the silence she kept those months, for letting me feel humiliated without understanding why. I remind her she wasn't protecting a secret from me. She was quietly building a case against the most powerful person in her life, alone, terrified, and determined to do it right. We sit on our porch most mornings now, coffee steaming between us, sometimes with the distant sound of news helicopters circling downtown as Richard's trial approaches this spring. I think often about structures, about how the loudest crack in a building is rarely where the real failure begins. The true fracture hides quietly, spreading for years beneath the surface, until someone finally has the courage to point at it in front of everyone who refused to look. Richard's trial begins in April. Investigators in Phoenix have reopened the older case, and rumors are already circulating about additional victims from those earlier years. That story, I suspect, is far from over. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like, and share for more interesting stories.